Brienne watched the line of the horizon. The afternoon sunlight turned the fields a dull gold. "He will not harm you again, my lord," she said, trying to impart all of her determination into those words. Renly granted her a small nod, though the tension in his eyes did not fade. "We will camp here for the night and approach at first light. Tell the men to hold position. I want to see Stannis's arrangements with my own eyes before we commit ourselves." He motioned to a cluster of knights waiting for orders. They dispersed, and soon the entire host was halting, pitching tents for another night under the open sky, this time closer than ever to the threat they had pursued. As the day wore on, Renly convened a war council in a large field tent, its flaps lifted to allow in the lingering warmth. Loras was present, as were several notable lords from the Stormlands and Reach. Brienne stood behind Renly, a silent sentinel, aware that she was an oddity in such gatherings, but determined to fulfill her role. She could see the tension in Renly's posture as he laid out the plan to encircle Stannis's camp from two directions, ensuring there would be no escape to the sea. The lords concurred, though some cautioned that Stannis was a seasoned commander and would not allow himself to be trapped easily. "If we strike at dawn, we catch him off guard," said Ser Rabar Royce. "His men won't expect us to be so bold." Renly nodded. "Agreed. But we must be prepared for—" He hesitated, searching for the right phrase. "Unconventional tactics." One of the lords spat. "You mean that devilry that nearly took your life, my king?" Renly's eyes flickered. "Yes, our men must be prepared for anything. We do not know the extent of this red woman's abilities." Loras interjected. "Whatever she conjures, it can be cut down." His gaze slid to Brienne, acknowledging the fact that she had proven it once. Renly ended the council with a nod. The men filed out, each weighed by the knowledge of a dawn battle. Outside, the sky deepened into a swirl of pink and gold as the sun began its slow descent. The war horns had already sounded to inform the men they would be fighting soon. The atmosphere in the camp crackled with tension. Squires busied themselves, armorers checked and rechecked gear. Horses were fed and watered carefully. Small fires dotted the encampment, around which men shared words of encouragement or told crude jokes to mask their nerves. Renly remained mostly quiet throughout the late afternoon and into the evening. He knew well the significance of the approaching battle. If Stannis was defeated here, Renly's claim to the throne would gain immense credibility. The realm might rally behind him, but if he fell, then all he had built would collapse, leaving the Iron Throne open to other claimants entirely. And overshadowing all of this was the memory of that black shape in the night, that roiling shadow that came so close to ending his life. Despite his outward bravado, he was deeply unsettled. Near sunset, Marjorie arrived, escorted by a small retinue, having insisted she come closer to the front to show support for her husband. Renly greeted her warmly, though his smile was tinted with sorrow for having to involve her in the precarious conflict. She reassured him that her place was at his side, even if only to comfort the soldiers by her presence. Her charm and calm demeanor soothed many frayed nerves, and the men welcomed her as a symbol of hope. But the night pressed on, and with it came the questions that had no answers. How do you fight a shadow? Could it appear again, in the midst of so many men and wards of steel? Brienne never left Renly's side, though exhaustion gripped her. She feared letting her guard down, even for a moment, in case the assassin returned. Loras, too, seemed restless, pacing through the camp. The tension between him and Brienne simmered, but there was no open confrontation. They both had a singular purpose: protect Renly, the man they each loved in their own way. Night fell fully, and with it came a hush. The torches threw flickering light over rows of tents. The standard poles creaked in a gentle breeze. Men tried to sleep, but many found the attempt futile. The final hours before a battle are a unique torment. Everything is possible: triumph, glory, death, or dishonor. Each soldier wrestled with his own nightmares under the dim glow of campfires. Renly's tent stood in the center of it all, though this time far more heavily guarded than on the previous nights. Rows of guards, both Tyrell and Baratheon men, kept watch. Knights slept in shifts, swords and lances within arm's reach. Brienne was determined no shadow would pass them unseen. The night remained uneventful for many hours, quiet except for the occasional soft whinny from the picket lines or the distant rustle of leaves. Brienne stood vigil, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the ring of torchlight. She gripped the pommel of her sword, finding comfort in its solidity. Each time her eyelids felt heavy, she forced herself to blink, remembering the monstrous shape that had threatened Renly before. She half expected it to reappear at any moment. But the hours slipped by with no sign of black sorcery. Occasionally, Loras checked on them, exchanging few words before drifting off again to ensure the camp's readiness. Marjorie, having insisted on staying close, dozed in a nearby pavilion, though it was unlikely she found any true rest. Renly himself tried to sleep, lying on a cot behind thick curtains, and though his eyes might have closed, Brienne suspected he did not truly succumb to slumber. Near the very edge of dawn, a pale light began to creep across the horizon. Brienne blinked at it, for the night had passed without further incident. She felt relief, fleeting as it was, coupled with a deep exhaustion. She could hear motion in the camp as men rose to prepare for the battle. Within the tent, Renly stirred. She caught a glimpse of him sitting up, running a hand through his hair. Despite all that had happened, he looked composed, regal in his manner. She marveled at how some men can slip on confidence like well-fitted armor, even when fear must be gnawing inside. Wordlessly, she brought him fresh water to wash his face. He thanked her, looking at her with that kindly expression that warmed her heart. When he spoke, his voice was pitched so that only she could hear. "You look as though you've been awake all night." Brienne dipped her head. "I have, my lord, but I feel no tiredness that would prevent me from doing my duty." He reached out, placed a hand on her wrist with surprising gentleness. "Your loyalty astounds me, Brienne. Once this is done, I promise you will have some well-deserved rest." She bowed her head again, touched by his words. "I will rest once I know you are safe, my king." Outside, trumpets blared, a fanfare to rouse the army for the coming fight. The sun had not fully crested the horizon, but the sky glowed with the promise of sunrise. Men began to fall into formation. Horses whinnied as they were led to lines, knights hoisting themselves into saddles, squires adjusting stirrups. The clank of metal on metal rose into the cold morning air. Banners were lifted, snapping in the growing breeze. Renly donned his armor with the aid of his squires. Piece by piece, polished steel covered him. The golden stag on his breastplate gleamed. He turned to Brienne, who was already armored, wearing her rainbow cloak. For a moment he regarded her. "Stand with me. When we face Stannis, I want the realm to see you among my vanguard. Let everyone know you are the sword that can cut through the blackest magic." Brienne swallowed. "It would be my honor." Then, with a final nod, Renly stepped out of the tent, mounted his horse, his armor shining in the half-light as if chasing away the shadows. Loras joined him on one side, Brienne on the other. Marjorie watched from a short distance away, her face schooled into confidence, though worry lingered in her eyes. She knew that once the army departed, she could do little but wait for word of victory or defeat. Renly gave the order, and the column began to move. It was a breathtaking sight in the early dawn. Thousands of armed men, cavalry, foot soldiers, archers, all forging ahead in tight ranks. The ground shook under the weight of hooves and boots. The rising sun tinted the edges of their armor gold, a reflection of the stags on their banners. The Stormlands men cheered as they marched, as if hoping their own voices would chase away any last vestiges of night's terror. The Tyrell forces, more disciplined, advanced methodically, yet even among them were murmurs of excitement and tension. Scouts had reported that Stannis was positioned only a few miles away, beyond a slight ridge. The plan was for Renly's cavalry to charge from the right flank while the main body of infantry struck the center. Meanwhile, auxiliary forces from the left flank, commanded by key lords, would loop around to prevent any retreat or flanking maneuver. Renly himself intended to lead the vanguard in the center, showing his men that he was no coward. Brienne, her mouth set in a determined line, rode beside him, scanning the horizon for any sign of an ambush or, worse still, that dreadful shadow. At last they crested the ridge. Below lay a broad field sloping gently toward a patch of rocky outcroppings. There, arrayed in a formation of pikes and archers, were Stannis's men. The banners of the fiery heart, emblazoned with the stag, fluttered, a testament to his new allegiance to the Lord of Light. In the midst of the host, a tall figure in dark armor stood near a standard. The shape was unmistakable. It was Stannis Baratheon, Renly's elder brother, his face as grim as the iron crown he claimed. Renly reined in his horse, studying the disposition of forces. "Sound the horns," he commanded. "Let them know we are here. Perhaps my brother will see sense." A series of blasts on trumpets echoed across the field. Stannis's camp responded with their own horns. The two armies shifted, men gripping weapons more tightly. The silence that stretched between the blasts was pregnant with the possibility of slaughter. Brienne felt the tension thrumming in her chest. She saw no sign of that red-robed woman among Stannis's men, but she did not relax. She knew the greatest threat might be the one unseen. Renly's host began to descend the slope, stirring dust and the scent of churned earth into the air. Archers positioned themselves, waiting for the signal. Pikemen marched in disciplined lines. The cavalry fanned out, lances poised. Stannis's lines held steady. For a heartbeat, it seemed as if both sides were waiting for the other to blink. That moment stretched, slowed, as though the entire battlefield were holding its breath. Then a cry went up from Renly's side, and the forward lines began to move at a trot. Soon it became a canter, then a thunderous charge. The foot soldiers followed behind, while Renly, flanked by Loras and Brienne, spurred his horse forward in a swift gallop. The horns blared again, signaling the advance, and the ground shook with the drumming of hooves. On Stannis' side, a line of pikemen leveled their weapons, bracing for impact, while archers drew back their bowstrings. Sunlight glinted off steel points as the first wave of arrows hissed through the air. Brienne gritted her teeth, lifted her shield, and ducked behind it as arrows rained down. Some bounced off her shield. Others found gaps among the cavalry, felling a few men and horses with ragged cries. But the charge continued. The cavalry slammed into the ranks of Stannis's men, lances cracking against armor and flesh. The screams of men and horses intermingled, and the two armies crashed together in a cacophony of steel. Renly was in the thick of it, slashing downward at pikemen who tried to spear his mount, spurring his horse to keep moving. Loras skewered an enemy soldier with a thrust of his lance before discarding it for his sword. Brienne rode with them, her sword cutting a path. She felt the impact jar her arm each time she struck. Blood sprayed across her armor, and she forced down any thought but the need to protect Renly, to keep him in sight. She glanced over at him just in time to see him parry a blow aimed at his chest. Meanwhile, the rest of the army poured down the slope. Stannis's lines bowed under the onslaught, but they did not break. Through the din, Brienne heard Renly shouting commands, urging the infantry to press forward, encouraging the cavalry to maneuver for another charge. The battlefield churned into chaos. Men in Baratheon gold and men in fiery hearts grappled in vicious close combat. Spears snapped, shields buckled, and the earth grew slick with mud and blood. The air was filled with the raw stench of battle. Suddenly, a roar went up from the left flank. Brienne risked a quick glance. A contingent of Stannis's knights had broken from their lines, circling around to flank Renly's vanguard. If they succeeded, it could force Renly's men into a deadly trap. Already, she could see mounted knights in dark armor galloping toward them, swinging swords and axes, smashing into the flank of unprepared infantry. Renly saw it too, and he raised his sword. "Regroup. To me. Rally on the king." His nearest bannermen responded, trying to close ranks. Loras signaled a retreat to form a defensive line. But in the swirling madness of the battlefield, disorder reigned. Half the men heard, half were locked in their own fights. Brienne urged her horse to Renly's side as he cut down a knight who tried to unseat him. "We need to regroup the vanguard, my lord," she shouted above the clamor. "Pull back and form a wedge." Renly nodded, waving for his bannermen to follow. They managed to wheel around, forging a small wedge formation. Yet the oncoming knights from Stannis' side bore down relentlessly. Loras joined them, adding his sword to the defense, but there seemed to be no immediate relief. Everywhere, men fought for their lives in an ever-shifting tapestry of violence. The clang of steel battered Brienne's ears, and her muscles ached from each blow. She felt a desperate surge of adrenaline that urged her to keep going, keep swinging, keep protecting. Still, despite the chaos, she remained acutely aware of Renly. Each time a foe lunged for him, she put herself in the path. Her sword found its mark again and again, though the collisions reverberated up her arms. Renly, too, fought like a man cornered by 1,000 fears, determined to show his men that he was no coward. Slowly, painfully, the wedge formation worked. Renly's cavalry, reassembled under his banner, began to press forward once more, pushing Stannis' knights back. Across the battlefield, the rest of Renly's army capitalized on the momentum, surging with fresh vigor. War cries rang out. A band of archers rained arrows into Stannis' flank, opening gaps in their line. With a shout, Renly led the cavalry in a renewed charge, pounding into those gaps. The pikes wavered. Stannis' men began to break in places, forced back by the unstoppable tide of Renly's forces. Yet in the midst of the rising hope, Brienne felt an odd shift in the air, similar to the night when the shadow had come. Her skin prickled. She looked around, heart pounding, uncertain if the feeling was just the rush of battle or something more. The thunder of hooves, the screams of men, the metallic tang of blood, none of it masked that sense of a creeping darkness. Suddenly, a swirl of blackness appeared near a cluster of Renly's men who were pressing forward. Brienne saw it only because she happened to glance in that direction. Her blood ran cold. It was the same thing. A living shadow, darker than the darkest night, twisting among the swirl of dust and debris. One of Renly's soldiers stumbled back from it, terror etched on his face, before the shape coalesced into a vaguely human form and slashed at him with a shadow blade. The soldier collapsed, his throat opened. Brienne shouted in alarm, pointing with her sword. Renly turned in his saddle just in time to see it. The shadow advanced rapidly through the chaos, cutting down any who stood in its path, forging a line straight toward Renly. The men around it stared in horror, their weapons passing through it uselessly. Arrows soared by it, tearing through the air, but it did not falter. "Gods preserve us," Renly breathed. The face beneath his helm turned pale. "Brienne again?" She met his gaze, her jaw set. "I will stop it." Without waiting for him to argue, she spurred her horse forward, charging straight at the shadow. Loras shouted something, but she didn't hear, her entire being focused on the swirling darkness that threatened her king. She recalled how her blade had found some tenuous resistance before. She prayed to whatever gods would listen that it would again. The shadow, sensing her approach, whipped its head-like form in her direction. It moved with impossible speed, sliding across the ground without form. She raised her sword, letting out a war cry. The creature twisted away at the last instant, slipping to her left. Her horse reared, nearly unseating her. She swung a wide arc with her blade, feeling a faint resistance when it connected with the darkness. A shriek, unearthly, rang out. It was like hearing nails on slate, scraping at her ears. Men nearby recoiled, uncertain if they should intervene. Some cowered, believing it was a demon. The shadow hissed, flailing about for a moment. Then it stabilized, refocusing on Renly, who was only a few paces away, locked in a struggle with two of Stannis' knights. Brienne dug her heels into her horse's flanks, maneuvering to stay between them. "Over here!" she shouted, trying to draw its attention. "Face me, you abomination!" She slashed again, forcing it back. The shadow shimmered, wavering as if caught between two shapes. Then it lunged at her, a black blade stabbing toward her heart. She twisted her torso just in time, the point scraping across her armor rather than piercing flesh. She brought her own sword down in a brutal two-handed blow, feeling that odd sensation of slicing through thick, acrid air. A savage cry tore from her throat. She pressed the attack, ignoring the sudden exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. The shadow reeled under the onslaught. She felt something wet, though it could not be blood, splatter across her gauntlet like a foul-smelling tar. Another inhuman wail, and the creature seemed to quiver, as if losing some of its cohesion. This time, it took on a fleeting shape reminiscent of a gaunt, long-limbed man. Its featureless face opened in a silent scream as it slid backward, away from the blade that could hurt it. Spurred on by the flicker of hope, Brienne followed, swinging again and again. The onlookers could only stare, mesmerized, as the giant woman battled a living shadow amidst the chaos of a pitched war. Each time the creature tried to dart around her, she was there to block it. Each time it formed that dreadful blade of darkness, she parried, steel connecting with shadow in defiance of all that made sense. "Brienne!" Renly cried from somewhere behind her. She could not look to him, could not afford a moment of distraction. If she let the shadow slip by, it would end her king in an instant. Her arms ached from the brutal pace, her lungs burned, but she kept up the dance of steel. She battered it step by step, forcing it back across the battlefield. Men parted in a wide circle, terror etched on their faces. They had never seen anything like this. Swords and spears hung useless in their hands. Some fell to their knees in prayer.